Right. So thank you very much once again, Professor Dirk Wentzel, for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining this session this morning. We are pleased to have Professor Dirk Wentzel. Before we start, I would like to read briefly his CV, his wonderful CV. And I'm sure that we will not have enough time to read all of the CV because he has amazing profile. So Professor Dirk Wentzel is Professor of Economics and European Economic Relations at Pforzheim University. Since 2005, he has held the EU-funded Jean Monnet Chair. He has been director of the European Business, Politics and Culture Summer School in collaboration with Pennsylvania State University since 2008. Professor Dirk Wentzel studied economics at the University of Bonn. He earned his doctoral degree in 1994 with a dissertation in monetary theory at the University of Marburg. In 2001, he completed his habilitation in media economics, also at the University of Marburg. He has had multiple research stays abroad, including at Lomonosov, Moscow State University, New York University, and Pennsylvania State University. He was a visiting professor between 2000 and 2002 at Penn State, where he also founded a summer school in cooperation with the Smil College of Business. And he was a scholarship student of the Adenauer Foundation, for which he serves as trustee today. And he was also awarded the Herbert Quant Prize for his dissertation and received a research fellowship from the Humboldt Foundation. And in 2011, he has been named president of the Humboldt Foundation Karlsruhe Pforzheim Regional Group. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So that's briefly about Professor Dirk Wentzel. Professor Dirk Wentzel, you have 1.5 hours, including question and answers with our students. So the time is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Luluk, for your very kind introduction. And this is the only problem of having such a long CV. That means you are getting quite old to achieve all that. I try to open now the screen. Let's see if we can share this. Well, then also from my side, a warm welcome to this presentation and a warm welcome also to our discussion. We are in a very specific situation all over the world now. We have the corona pandemic, and we as economists, of course, worked a lot about this topic in the last 2.5 years. And that's why when I was asked here in Gajah Mada to give a speech, so we talked about the topic economic implications of the corona pandemic for Germany and the European Union. And then at the end of my presentation, I will give a special focus also on the sports and on the media markets. There is a background for that, why I give talk also about the sport and the media sector. As Luluk has said in his introduction, I did my habilitation work, so the second PhD about the US media markets. So I'm a media economist too, and I've always been interested in the media. And since 10 years, I'm also teaching sports economics for our international students at Pforzheim University. So sports and media became not only my hobbies, but also my professional focus. And that's why I will also talk a little bit about that. In one of our previous conversations, I talked with Risa about my latest book. I wrote a book, The Economics of Sports, Media and Entertainment, and edited this in 21, so last October. So this is also my background, why I will also talk here about sports and media sector, even though what Luluk has said, I'm an economist, I'm a traditional economist, and I focus on European integration stuff. So what is my agenda? My agenda today is, first of all, I would like to give you a bigger perspective about the pandemic. Corona has been a challenge for science, for health, for economic systems, and what we see also in some countries for the political stability in these countries. The economic impact in Germany and in the European Union will be my second focus. It is enormous. There was nothing that can be compared to the economic effect of the corona crisis. We had multiple crises in the European Union. As you know, we had the financial crisis, we had the sovereign debt crisis, we had the migration crisis, and of course, there were several of these challenges, but nothing that can be compared to the impact of the corona pandemic. I would like to also give a little historical perspective on that, only short, trust me on that. I have 3 kids, also students. They think that history is boring, and I disagree a little bit with my dear kids, but it's very important to have a bigger perspective how this pandemic comes along and how it can be compared to things we already had on this planet. Of course, as an economist, I have to talk about the money. The corona pandemic is a very expensive crisis, and that will be the next chapter of my speech here. I will talk about the effect on the state budget, and I will also try to demonstrate there's only one way to finance this crisis. This is indeed the capital market. It is not possible to finance this crisis with tax increases or with reduction of government spending. Quite the opposite is necessary right now. We will talk about that. I think from your international perspective, the next point might be very interesting. The European Union answer, Next Generation EU. This is a program we have launched in the European Union, how to react to this challenge. And I would like also to give you some numbers. When I was young, €1 million or $1 million was a lot of money. Today we are talking about billions and trillions. So the volume of the EU rescue package is really enormous. And at the end, then of course I will talk about 2 case studies. The sports sector. The sports sector has been affected tremendously by the pandemic. But of course we have to make a distinction between professional sports and leisure sports. And professional sports, this is a big world of superstars like Roger Federer or Lionel Messi, but also the leisure sport has a very important function in the society. And one of the biggest social studies ever made in social science by Robert Putnam from Harvard University is dealing with that voluntary work. And I will talk also about this part of the sports sector. And when we talk about media and entertainment, the big winner, of course, of the pandemic is at some point entertainment and digitalization. I just mentioned Netflix or other streaming devices. But of course, other media areas have suffered tremendous losses. For example, the movie theaters and the theaters in general, operas. But we'll talk a little bit about also the media sector in general. So, this is the agenda, and please feel free to ask questions about every topic. And Corona is such a wide topic that I can only scratch the surface here with my presentation, but I think we will have time also in our discussion. One word under a very, very specific threat. What we see is that that was too fast. The Corona pandemic has hit every country in the world in a devastating way. And this is an interesting perspective, no matter what economic system, what political system, what religion, specific beliefs, ideologies, or whatsoever. I did my Ph.D. and my habilitation at Marburg University in an institute specialized on the comparison of economic systems. Very neutral, very technically, how do different economic systems work? And what we see now is that the corona pandemic is a little bit like an institutional stress test for every country. Every country is defined by institutions, by systems, by historical background, by resources. And the corona pandemic hits every country in a very different, but nevertheless in a very hard way. Corona reveals the institutional weaknesses in every country in a reckless way. And this is something what we have to acknowledge. There was an early, and I underline this point, my friends, there was an early OECD study in September 15th, 2020. So this was half a year into the pandemic. And the early study showed Germany was doing comparatively well in the beginning of the pandemic in the fight against COVID-19. what we have seen as economists is that the breakdown of the economy was only 5.4%. And Germany worked a lot with interesting tools like so-called Kurzarbeitergeld. That means you are unemployed, but nevertheless get the money from the government so that you can stay in your business and in your job, so that the economy will be able to restart. This restart is very, very important. We will talk about that point a little bit later. It is, we have to see there is a Corona shutdown problem, but there's also a Corona restart problem. What we see, for example, today on the airline sector, on international airlines. So October the 1st in Germany, Corona was almost over. We thought that's it. We had the first wave. And in 2020, 1st of October, we had only 2,000 infections all over Germany. This is what we have now in my hometown in Karlsruhe every day. On October 31st, same month, we had already 20,000 infections. And that's why, and my last bullet point here on the slide, 2nd of November 2020, we had a big second lockdown. And this lockdown was really serious and more or less stopped the whole economy completely. And since then, the economy has more or less jumped from lockdown to restriction, from further lockdowns, from further liberalizations, so reopenings of the economy, but we have not reached the pre-corona status, at least in Germany and in the European Union. May I ask a funny, or may I bring up a funny side remark? I was asked to give a speech about the economic effects of Corona, so today's topic, on November the 4th, 2020, because we thought Corona will be over. And I was asked to give the speech in the Studium Generale in Pforzheim University in front of 350 students and visitors. It ended up that I was in a completely empty lecture hall. We had at the first shutdown in the history of our university. So that's why November 2020 is really still tough in my memories. The intensity and the danger of the second wave and of the forthcoming waves was completely underestimated in Germany and in the European Union. As an economist, as a scientist, I have to say that. And this is a little bit also a sign of our democracies. We had in Germany public discussions about personal freedom and individual rights, about vacation and traveling, the famous trip to Mallorca. Side remark, my dear students, Germany is the #1 country in the world when it comes to traveling and spending for vacations. Germans love to travel, and the traveling is something that is almost sacred for the Germans. So vacation and traveling, restaurant visit, shopping, public life and concert, all this was in the focus of the discussion, and nobody wanted to have another lockdown. But what we can say, the worst case scenario that came from our colleagues from the health department and from the virologists, the worst case scenario was completely excelled. It got much worse in Germany and in the European Union than we had expected. From a scientific perspective, and as a Humboldt Fellow, I'm integrated in a lot of different scientific groups. From a scientific perspective, virology, medicine, sociology, political science, economics, law, and legal studies, we have to acknowledge in June 22, so today, that we do not have concluding results about Corona. We do not have them. Even the most fundamental question, my dear students, most fundamental question, how the virus evolved, is still completely unclear. There are several hypotheses about that, but nobody really knows exactly. New mutations emerge more or less every month. And what we know for sure is that the virus can also affect animals. In Denmark, we had the case of minks, and in the United States, we had the case of gorillas that had Corona, but we do not really know what that means, how the infection goes from human beings to animals and vice versa. So this is something that is kind, I don't want to say shocking, but still it gives me reason for concern that we do not even can answer these simple questions. The only thing that we know for sure is that the pandemic is more or less a mathematical function of exponential growth. I'm coming from mathematical economics, so I like to work also with numbers. Given the numbers of an infection over time, and given also the contagion of a virus, we can more or less calculate quite exactly the growth and the decline of the pandemic. The mathematical characteristics and the properties, my friends, might be unpleasant for the affected people, but the underlying function does not lie. So what I can tell you today, June 22nd, it's beautiful out here in Germany. I can already predict and know that in 3 to 4 months, we will have another huge wave of infections coming back to Germany, simply based on mathematical predictions. This is what we have to know. And as economists, we have to adjust to that. We have one important insight, and this is something that's, I think, very important also to manage the whole crisis. The first insight and finding is that the economic and the health curves, so the infection curves and the economic cost curves, are highly interdependent and intercorrelated. We cannot choose, if I may say so in quotation marks, my friends, we cannot choose between a healthy population or a healthy economy. Both things go hand in hand. Either we have a healthy economy and a healthy population, or both things go worse. That means, as economists, I know also with a view on the upcoming fall and winter, if the pandemic will further increase, also the macroeconomic costs will further grow. This is something we have to know. Right now, nobody can clearly calculate the costs for Germany and for Europe. And I tried to find a little bit data on that, Luluk. Also for Indonesia, it is not clear what is the overall bill we get for the corona pandemic. So what are the costs? And also with a view to our case study, sports and media keeps this also in mind at this point. What are the costs we know as economists? First of all, we have the direct costs. Direct cost of consumption and investment. We saw that right after the pandemic, the consumption had declined, investment had declined, and we've seen a lot of insolvencies, bankruptcies all over Europe. Bankruptcies are nothing else, economically spoken, as a destruction of capital, including also human capital, when people lose their job. But with the jobs, it's a very ambiguous situation. We have unemployment, high costs, and labor shortage at the same time. This seems to be a little bit like a contradiction in itself, but it is not. We have seen that a lot of people who were in hotel management or were in traveling stuff, they lost their jobs and left the sector. And now, while the economy is restarting and traveling is restarting, for example, our main airline carrier, Lufthansa, has a lot of problems to find people, to find staff working for them. So this is an interesting corona effect on the labor market. We have unemployment and labor shortage at the same time. Sounds like a contradiction. It is not. What we also have is a strong declining tax revenue in all European states. And this gives us a double threat. On the one hand side, we see increasing public debt. On the other hand side, we see reduced tax revenues. So that means the pressure on the state budget is further increasing. To sum up, my friends, what we can see, all elements of the GDP, of the gross domestic product, and all the calculation of the gross domestic product will be affected. That means corona is a problem that affects all sectors of the economy at the same time. Another point I would like to mention here, and that should not be neglected, the indirect costs of the corona pandemic. They are hard to measure, but I always tell my students, we can measure a lot of things that are not important, but there are many important things that we cannot measure. So we as economists have to be aware of this specific issue. And for example, we have indirect costs, increasing diseases and depressions. We see a lot of students, a lot of people who have lost their social contacts because of the pandemic, they show signs of depression and other diseases. In Germany, and at this point I can only speak for Germany because I do not have international data on that, but in Germany, we have a decline in education. We call it already the generation Corona. There were many, many kids that couldn't go to school for almost 2 years. So they missed a lot of classes, and they missed a lot of education, mathematics, in languages, in history, in science. So generation Corona, education. And of course, what we see also, and there is evidence and data about that, we see a lot of domestic violence against women, against children, because families during the lockdown were locked in their apartment. And not everybody has a nice house where family can spread out. A lot of people live in a small apartment, and then more tensions come up. These are costs. And I was asked by many of my colleagues and friends, please do include that in presentations. We, as economists, should show that we are aware of that. Well, now we are getting a little bit closer to the numbers and also about the policy options we have. Well, I'm focusing here, as you can see, a study from the IFO Institute in Munich. This is, I would say, one of our top 5 institutes about the assessment, about the evaluation of our economic situation. And of course, the IFO Institute is also an advisor to our chancellor, who is Olaf Scholz. I still have to get used to the name because after 16 years of Angela Merkel, now we have a new chancellor. And so our chancellor is advised, is instructed also by the IFO Institute. So, and what the colleagues from the IFO Institute said, we always have to make a distinction in Corona about the shutdown phase and the post-shutdown phase. And I added this here in small letters, see the airlines today. The airlines today had a terrible shutdown phase, and now they have a very difficult post-shutdown phase. So the reopening is not that you can just reopen it and it goes boom, goes back again. It is definitely not the point. And the IFO Institute calculated several scenarios about costs. As I said, a shutdown of 2 months, my friends, might cost the German economy between 255 and 495 billion. And the shutdown of 3 months would cost around 354 until 729 billion. Okay, these numbers are impressive. But for our purpose here and our presentation today, the last bullet point might be the most interesting. 1 single week of a shutdown is about 25 to 57 billion. As an economist with a background in mathematical economics and loving numbers, I can say, well, critically, between 25 and 57, that's a huge range. That cannot be a precise estimation. But even if we go with the lowest number, 25 billion, it is a number we should take into our memory and remember that in a few slides, I will start back to that point here. This is a very important number. A single week of a shutdown is about 25 billion up to 57 billion. What are the corona effects? And the first effect I would like to mention here is, of course, the distribution effect. And from an Oxfam study of 21, we know the pandemic is mainly affecting and hurting the poor people. There's a very strong effect, that what we can measure, what we can see. Well-educated, wealthy people find better ways to manage their life in a pandemic than uneducated and less wealthy people. So the Oxfam study from last year says the pandemic is mainly affecting and hurting the poor people who are losing their job, who cannot travel, who are forced to be in very small apartments with a big family. Of course, there are labor market effects, and the IFO Institute in Munich estimated that around 2 million jobs, 1.8 million jobs, are directly affected. But what we also see, and I mentioned that in several speeches about the pandemic already, is, and what makes it so difficult to tackle and handle this, is the extreme asymmetry of effects in the pandemic. The moderate decline in the first wave in Germany of only 5.4% was caused by the fact that we have some losers of the pandemic, but at the same time, we have huge, big tech winners. I will talk about that in my media case studies. So that means we have losers and winners, and the average effect is moderate. But if you're working in a hotel business, or if you're working as a travel agent, or if you're working as an airport shuttle, a friend of mine has this business, then you are devastated. And this is the asymmetry of effects that makes Corona so difficult to tackle from an economic perspective. The classical tools of Keynesian economics, of deficit spending, of classical economics, reduced taxes, all these effects do not really work 100% because some groups are doing well, other groups are suffering. We have, last bullet point here, a lot of effect on the airlines, hotels, restaurants, and the restart is more difficult than everybody thought. Well, now I come a little bit to my historical perspective. And historical perspective, I have to admit, it's also part of my CV. I worked 4 years as a student in the archive of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So I'm more or less also a trained historian, and I like to work also with history. And because we can learn a lot from history. And there are not too many new things on this planet. A lot of things already have happened. And if we know history, we know a little bit better how to handle this. Well, what is a common opinion among economists and historians is that there was never before a comparable health crisis in the world. There are comparisons, but if we look into detail, we see that all these comparisons are not really describing and analyzing what we are experiencing today. The first comparison that is very often made in literature and also in public discussions is the Spanish flu from 1918. The Spanish flu was a flu as a result of World War I in Europe, and the Spanish flu more or less killed 40 million people. But we know in 1918 there was no communication worldwide about that. So people, soldiers in the hospitals, they simply died and nobody knew what kind of disease they had. And until the knowledge about this flu was spread out among hospitals and researchers, it was already too late. So the Spanish flu is not comparable to the Corona crisis because the Corona crisis is now in the world of the internet, in the world of permanent communication, WhatsApp and other communication channels. So completely different situation. Another comparison that is always made is the world economic crisis in 1929. The world economic crisis was more or less caused by the breakdown of the stock market in New York and was more or less limited first to the United States and then trickled down to Europe. And there was no big effect on China, Asia, Africa, New Zealand, or Australia. Today, we have a world that is completely affected in every single state, even North Korea, a state in a permanent lockdown, so to say, is affected by the pandemic. And of course, also the post-war situation in Europe and in Germany is sometimes mentioned as a comparison to the Corona pandemic. Also, this comparison is somehow misleading. Why? Well, even though Germany and Europe was destroyed, but still the people had the intellectual capacity to rebuild it quickly. And there was not a risk that the war could come back. So that means as soon as the war was over, everybody was ready to restart and focus on the Wirtschaftswunder, the European economic miracle, the golden age. So, but nothing like this is seen right now in the pandemic. That means, to sum up, my friends, COVID-19 meets a highly interdependent and globalized world economy and tourism. And this is unprecedented in general. By the way, 2 weekends before, I just had a seminar on mobility and the effects on mobility because my latest Ph.D. student, she is writing a Ph.D. about mobility. And we also talked about the airline industry in this seminar. And Well, the real airline industry started in 1980. So then traveling by plane became affordable for regular people. And over the last 20 years, it exploded. In the 70s, when I grew up, still it was something very luxurious to be on an airplane. So not everybody could afford it. So that means today it's a completely different world. We are so interconnected that also the virus can spread out so quickly. So now let's talk a little bit about the effects on the state budget. Well, the German government launched a public debt in 2021 up to 218.5 billion. This is an all-time German record. We have never seen something like this before. My friends, I do not know exactly if you are familiar with the Stability Pact in Europe. That means every state who has joined the euro and the eurozone is only allowed to have a small deficit of maximum 3% of the GDP. So these are the famous Maastricht criteria or stability criteria we have in Europe. Last year, we had a deficit of 7.25 of the GDP, an all-time high. That means the government is under an unprecedented pressure. Now the number comes back from the IFO Institute. Wait for the number to trickle in. So what can the government do fiscally and financially? Well, first option, classical macroeconomic textbook wisdom, what we teach the students and test. Reduction of government spending. Then you can reduce your deficit, reduction of government spending. But in the situation we have right now, it is a classical Keynesian moment. The government needs to spend money to keep the restaurants alive, the hotels alive, the cultural life alive. So we need government spending. We cannot cut this. Then we have to increase, or the option is increasing taxes. This would be a nightmare for the economy in a situation of insecurity and, by the way, high inflation. Inflation is back to Europe. If we increase the taxes, we have a huge problem. And at this point, the heritage tax is very often mentioned. Heritage tax, the Americans call it the death tax, when rich persons pass away and pass their money to the next generation. What is a tax on this heritage? And some people say the rich people in Germany should pay more, and we have to double the heritage tax. Just to numbers, I love to work with numbers in such a presentation. We have now the overall income of Germany, of the German government from the heritage tax in 2021 was 9 billion. 9 billion. So if we double this, okay, a lot of protests, but we have 18 billion. And now go back to the number. One Corona week shutdown cost 25 billion. So even if we double the heritage tax in Germany, we cannot even finance 1 week of a Corona shutdown with that. I think this is a number you should keep in mind. So taxes, the increase of taxes and the reduction of government spending is not an option in this situation. We have to increase public debt, and we have to also increase the maturity and extend the maturity of public debt. That's the only way how we can handle this. We have to go through the capital market to finance that crisis. That is the only option we have realistically. Well, a few short words about international comparison. As I said in my introduction, Corona leads to a new comparison of economic and social and political systems. We had in international ranking good grades for some states, including Germany and Switzerland in the beginning, but that has changed over time. We had Corona situations and numbers in the United States, Brazil, and India that were very difficult. It has been in the United States a disaster. In the first time of the Corona, the government did not even recognize that there is a Corona pandemic. But what we have seen, the greatest concern about the effects for the developing countries, because Corona is easy to handle in a well-developed environment, but when social distances is not possible, when hygiene is a problematic thing, when masks are not available and home office is not possible, then the virus is getting really vicious, and this is what we see in a lot of developing countries. Now let's talk about the European perspective, and I look at I'm perfectly in my time budget. Now let's look at the European perspective, and I think maybe for you from the Indonesian perspective, that might be very interesting to see how the European Union in general tackled this issue. So what they did in 2020 is that they set up a financial budget up to 1,074.3 billion. So more than 1,000 billion financial budget for the next 6 years in the European Union. And then next bullet point in red bold letters, we have funded, and I may say we as a Jean Monnet professor in the European, we have started the Next Generation EU Special Fund. So this is a fund that finances directly Corona problems and Corona issues. And it is also funded with 750 billion. So that means overall, if we sum up the budget plus the Next Generation EU funding, we come up about 1.8 trillion euro as a financial resources to tackle this crisis in Europe. My friends, I just want to mention, this is, of course, the largest financial package we've ever seen in the European history, we've ever seen in the world history. Never ever there was such a package before. Look into more details. The 700 billion Next Generation EU package is divided into different little sub-packages, and we have 390 billion direct and immediate help. They don't have to be paid back. It's direct help and support for countries. They have to be financed over the capital market. And for example, Spain. We love to travel to Spain, but Spain has been tremendously affected by the pandemic because tourism is the most important sector in Spain. And a lot of young people work in that area and they have no social insurance. So that means 2 years of Corona means 2 years of unemployment. And this is a terrible effect for the young generation in Spain. So these countries needed more support than other countries. So Spain, Portugal, also Italy, France, these countries were more affected than others. Next bullet point, 360 billion euro were offered in form of cheap credits, and they have to be paid back until 2058. So this is interesting. Very likely I will not be alive in 2058 anymore, but that's exactly the idea. We have to stretch. We have to stretch the effect. There's no way, my dear friends, and you can talk to all specialists from finance from all countries in the world. There's no way how these numbers can be financed by one generation. No way. And it's simply too much money. And that's why we have to stretch it over a long period of time. What we've seen also, a temporary increase of the contribution of the wealthy states to the budget, to the European Union budget, from 1.4% of their GDP to 2.0% of their GDP. Strong and healthy countries like Germany can afford to pay more than countries that are still in transition, like, let's say, Bulgaria or Romania or Cyprus. So that's why the burden on the strong countries, France, Germany, has increased. And the last point, I have two hearts in my chest, and I'm the classical economy on the one side, I'm the economist now trying to solve a current problem. For the first time in history, the European Union has issued bonds, European bonds, and took credit from the capital market. Excuse me. I was always critical about issuing bonds in the names of Europe, but I think there was no alternative to that at this point. Of course, we have to ask as economists, is this the ghost out of the bottle? So open we a new field of financial indiscipline? But at this point, I saw really no alternative to that. We have this, I mentioned that Stability and Growth Pact in Europe, the Maastricht criteria. It was interrupted 2021 and will be also interrupted this year. the single 27 states can also use their own financial resources to support the economy. And that means the states bring a lot of money and liquidity into the market to survive. The Next Generation EU fund, as I said, is 750 billion. I mentioned that, but 70% will be spent of that money in 21 and 22. So this year, last year, and 30% will be reserved for next year. So that means the spending is on the way, mostly infrastructure, investment, and things like that. Just a side remark there, and you see the big green bold letters. We have the special role of some countries who are very critical about issuing public debt, and these are the so-called frugal five or the solid five. This is Austria, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and Finland. These countries are more critical about public debt, while countries like France, Italy, Spain, and the southeastern countries are more positive about public debt. Well, to remember that point here, the 750 billion will be borrowed from the European financial and capital markets. It is not possible to increase taxes. There's no way that this could be done. Capital is available in huge amounts, and capital is desperately seeking new investment opportunity, because in Europe we have since now 4 years a zero interest environment. So if you have capital, you cannot bring it to the bank account. You have to invest, and therefore investment opportunities are scarce. And that means here at this point, the capital market has enough money and volume so that they could finance this crisis. The European Central Bank is supporting this crisis also with cheap money. We have the famous PEP program. PEP is an abbreviation standing for Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. This is cheap money for the economy so that they really can keep the economy going in the crisis situation. All this public debt that was issued and launched has to be paid back, of course, and it should be started to pay back in 2027. Hopefully Corona is done by that time, until 2058. We're getting to the end of the European perspective, and that's why I'm changing the color now and go to the European blue. What we see, and as a result of this crisis, for the future, the European Union receives independent financial resources. We will have in the future, as an additional income, a tax on plastic. The European Union is trying to tackle plastic and plastic now. Tax on plastic of about 80 cents per kilogram. This is 800 euro per ton of plastic. We will launch a CO2 tax on the emission of carbon dioxide beginning in 2023. And there will be a tax, my friends, on digital businesses and services. And potentially there will be also a financial transaction tax on specific financial transactions on the market. There will be trade with environmental certificates for emission trading to reduce the CO2 emissions. And also trains and cruise ships will be included in that overall calculation of these CO2 emissions. So for the future, the European Union is trying to get their own independent financial resources and opportunities. All countries will profit directly. The European perspective, some countries, some affected countries will be supported above average, Italy, Spain, France. And I think they deserve it. They were struck by lightning. They were struck by the disaster. Interestingly, side remark, the United Kingdom will not receive financial or fiscal support because of Brexit. And this is also a funny little side story to the whole story here. The pandemic has hit the UK immediately 1 week, not kidding, 1 week after they left the European Union. So that means all these rescue packages are for the 27 member states, not for the UK anymore. Big question, are there strategic differences between Germany and European interests? German interests and European interests? A very clear answer at this point. As a German professor, no. Germany is the most important trade partner for all European countries. France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. We are the most important trade partner for all these countries. And I know only if these countries are healthy and recovering, we as a German economy can be healthy and recovering. That means these partners are our most important trade partners. That's why I am totally fine with the fact that these countries receive more out of the Corona package than Germany. There's also a critical point I would like to mention here. Of course, at some point, we have to stop spending and we have to make sure that we can pay for all that. Europe has a so-called Green Deal to fight climate change in Europe. And this Green Deal funding has been reduced from 40 billions to 70 billions. And also the European budget in the area of research, health, and migration have been reduced. So that means in order to finance the Corona effect, we had to cut other expenditures in other areas. Also critical is, of course, with all the rescue packages and financial support, we have some zombie companies and some zombie states. So states or companies that more or less need something like a bankruptcy to restart, but with all that financial support coming in, it's hard if they really make a new start or if they just simmer a little bit. Financially and fiscally, it is hard to imagine how all these enormous amounts of debt can ever be paid back, but I have to leave this question open to our discussion. But what are the alternatives in these unprecedented times? What could we have done different or better? I admit I don't see any real alternatives. And now in the last 15 minutes, let's talk about two sectors of the economy I'm specifically interested. Not only that I teach sports, also two family members are really in the sports sector as professional athletes, and also the media has been always in the focus of my interest. First of all, let's talk about the sports sector more in general. And when you teach sports economics and sports management, you have to spread out the different aspects of sports. And there are microeconomic aspects and there are macroeconomic aspects of sports. When we look at the microeconomics aspect first, we see single persons and their behavior in markets and in decision processes. For example, athletes, for example, certain managers and their behavior and their decisions. So single people in sports, single persons and their behavior in markets have to be acknowledged and analyzed. Then we see teams, sportsmen and sportswomen, and spectators, people going to sports events. We know that for many, many years now, 2 years, more or less spectators were not allowed in stadiums anymore. So at least in closed buildings, it was not possible to have these events. So teams, sportsmen, women, spectators are directly affected from the pandemic. And then we see interaction in different institutional settings and rules. So that means when we change rules in the sports sector, we have a direct effect on the behavior of people. And we could also see this during the pandemic crisis. Then we go to the macroeconomic aspects of the sports sector, general economic developments, labor markets, investment, public health. So that means, for example, the Bundesliga, I think you maybe from time to time like to see some soccer or European football and know some German soccer players. The Bundesliga is one of the biggest employers in Germany. So that means it's one of the biggest company and more than 2 million people are coming to the stadium every weekend in Germany. More than 2 million people. So it's one of the biggest employer. We are not talking about sport is fun, just, easy. No, we are talking about one of the biggest employer of Germany. On a regular game day in the Allianz Arena of Bayern Munich, Bayern Munich, I'm sure, on a regular game day, 2,000 people are working there. And the Allianz Arena and Bayern Munich is one of the biggest taxpayer in Munich. So that means general economic developments, labor markets, investment. We are talking about the sports sector, one of the most important financial sectors in Germany. Then there are, of course, always implications of great sports events. For example, Olympic Games, the Football World Cup, Wimbledon tennis. So that means sport is money and sport is employment. And if sport cannot happen because of the pandemic, a lot of people are losing their job in the sports sector. As I said, for more than 2 years, it was not possible to have people in the stadium. You know, this tennis player here, potentially the best tennis player of all days, Roger Federer. You see him playing here in Wimbledon. Wimbledon was canceled the first time in the history of the tournament, which was in a peacetime. So Wimbledon had been canceled during the war, but not in peacetime. The pandemic caused Wimbledon to shut down for the first time. You know, this guy, Lewis Hamilton, 7-time Formula One racing champion, also other sports sectors like racing were directly affected. The Formula One for more than 2 years was organized without viewers in the stand and under very strict Corona rules. So that means also this sector of sports was affected. And last but not least, and of course this is the focus now, soccer. Soccer is the #1 sport of the world. It's not the most competitive league in the world. This is a National Football League in the United States, but all over the world, soccer is played. Latin America, in the United States, Europe, Asia, and of course also in Indonesia. So this was also a highly affected sport. And this is a point we are talking about elite sports. And we have to make a comparison when we talk about the corona effects in sports, difference between elite sports, you see here competing at the Olympics, and leisure sport as a very important voluntary work sector of the economy. My friends, let's look very general. This is Sports Economics 101, first class, first semester. What are the sources of income for professional sports? Of course, tickets and game day income from food and drink. The biggest stadium in Germany, and I try to put some flash, put some motivation here on these numbers. The biggest stadium in Germany for soccer is the stadium of Borussia Dortmund. And 80,000 people are coming to every home game of Borussia Dortmund, always sold out. One game day missed because empty stands cost Borussia Dortmund 4 million. So we are talking about 17 home games in regular season. 2 years is 34 multiplied with 4 million. That means the loss of Borussia Dortmund only by ticketing for the 2 Corona seasons is more than 100 million. So you see how this is affected directly by Corona. Then next point, sponsoring is an income also dependent on the people in the stadium and the viewers on television. Merchandising, media income, national and international, financial rewards, for example, from the Champions League, and transfer fees. These are classically the sources of income for professional sports. And now there are different sports than only football or soccer, because a team like Bayern Munich had a huge loss because they had to play in an empty stadium, so no ticket revenues. But still, they had all their worldwide sponsoring and merchandising, and their media money from national and international sources. Other sports, for example, basketball, handball in Germany, they suffered even more because they only get their income from tickets, only from their viewers in the game. So that means a lot of these teams almost went bankrupt in Germany and all over Europe. So that means, depending on what kind of sports you have, soccer, handball, hockey, ice hockey, so you have a different mix of income sources, and the Corona pandemic affected them all. But if you are mainly focusing on ticket income, then you have a huge problem. We see the factors of income in a more general perspective. You see the first icon here, money. Of course, the financial endowments of the teams, the professional teams, had been reduced, had declined during the pandemic. And the second icon, also the income for the players. More or less all the teams had to reduce their salaries, and that's why a lot of players disappeared. The third icon, you see a lot of people, of course, the whole thing in sports is changing when you have a filled stadium like Liverpool and you have a great atmosphere and singing and support. Then it feels and sounds and smells like football. But if it's empty, huge point. Fourth icon, you see all the entertainment you have when you go to a stadium. In a modern world, a stadium is a multi-purpose entertainment area. And that's why we have also multi-purpose entertainment stadiums and facilities. So that means it's not only about being in a seat and watching the game, it's about getting food, buying merchandise stuff, and so on. And all this business disappeared during the pandemic. That means the fifth icon, the first on the lower side, most stadiums could not be used. Only outdoor facilities were able to be used, at least in the summer months, but in the winter months, everything was closed. And that means you see a huge effect on the sports. The weather is a point. In the winter time, when everything is closed, I think it will be also difficult in the upcoming winter to have indoor sports with full seats. Then we see this nice picture of Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo in the old rivalry, Real Madrid against Barcelona. That was maybe the best rivalry ever. And these players are affected directly because they could not compete for a very long time. And this is a ghost. In Germany, we call the games in an empty stadium the ghost games, Geisterspiele. And you see that these ghost games were extremely costly, and they have a lot of effects also for the clubs and for the management. Bayern Munich is a very healthy club compared to the teams in Spain or to the teams in England or to the teams also in Italy. But Bayern Munich had a loss last year of around 100 million because of the corona pandemic. Excuse me. Now we are coming to the second part of sports. We are talking about leisure. You see the little kids here, and maybe your first question comes up: what does this have to do with the sports sector? Well, leisure sport is one of the most important points of voluntary work in the economy. And we do not have financial incentives to be in that sector. And there's a famous study by Harvard professor Robert Putnam about all these leisure sports, because all the leisure sports adds a lot to the social capital of an economy. And for those of you who are interested in social studies, I can really recommend the study Bowling Alone, the Harvard study from Robert Putnam. Leisure sport adds to social capital, and social capital, non-financial incentives. Social capital is very important for an economy. So I looked at the teams for intramural sports, so for hobby. And in the year 2018, so the last year before the corona pandemic, we had around 90,000 clubs in Europe where teams could have sports and people could have sports just as a hobby. We had a survey about around 20,000 clubs, and most of these clubs were absolutely healthy. That has changed in the pandemic, and that's a huge effect for the social capital. The lockdown we had for almost 2 years has changed physical education. So the education of kids who are not in a professional area has changed physical education dramatically. A lot of people have left their club and the team, and that means reduced members, means also reduced incomes. All these, we call it sportsmen and sportswomen for hobby, had no opportunities to practice and be on the pitch and be on the game. So reduced income and reduced revenue, it is a very, very difficult time for non-professional sport in Germany and in Europe. School sport was not possible for 2 years. We have a side effect also. We see a lot of young kids, students who have overweight and are not in good shape, healthy-wise. Swimming class, it had to be canceled for 2 years, so swimming could not be taught. So a lot of young kids in Germany don't know how to swim. And also, I would like to mention that sports has integration functions. A country like Germany that has a lot of migrants, the integration of the migrants to the society through the sports sector is enormous. And this could not be realized during the pandemic time. What about the athletes? Now, this is a microeconomic perspective. Well, we have a lot of athletes on a top level and on a moderate level, and they could not practice, so they were isolated in practice, no competition. So for these athletes, it was more or less a breakdown in their CV. Loss of focus, literally they had nothing to do. And for many of these young kids who are working hard to go to the Olympics or to go wherever, this nothing to do was difficult. It also lost a loss of reduction in sponsoring, loss of media attention, and finally, financial bottlenecks came up for these guys. Germany, and this is the last point for the sports sector, has launched a rescue package also for the sports sector, around 200 million, just with a special focus that we do not have a lost generation corona in sports. I skip now the preconditions for the applications and go to the last two slides. What are the media effects? And I'm almost perfectly done with my time budget. What are the media effects? Well, the media is split in its effect, a little bit different to the sports sector, because the media received a huge boom through the pandemic in the area of digitalization. That what we are doing right now, that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. Netflix, DAZN, and other streaming devices, they popped up like mushrooms after a big rain. So that means these are the big winners in the pandemic, the shutdown. People were starting to watch more television, to watch more series. Google and other search engine exploded. People spent more time online. And of course, Amazon is a big winner, at least in Germany and Europe. Online shopping exploded. Also, digital communication got a huge boost from the pandemic. For example, 4 weeks after the pandemic at Pforzheim University, we were completely online already. 4 weeks after the pandemic. So Zoom, WebEx, AlphaView, and all these digital communication devices, they became very popular. And this is now a new sector. Combination of sports and media. Esport exploded. Esports, League of Legends, and Warcraft, World of Warcraft, and all these games that can be played commercially, plus the FIFA games and everything, they exploded. This is now a sector that's extremely popular also in Germany. Also here we can say in the media sector, we have a lot of asymmetric consumption and distribution effect. You have to be able to afford different platforms and devices in order to participate in all these media events. And what we found out, for example, when it comes to media consumption, is that in less wealthy households, there is only one computer. So that means you cannot use all the devices simultaneously. You have to focus on certain points. The movie theaters in Germany suffered tremendously. They were closed for 2 years. Theaters, operas, and cultures were negatively affected. They had a negative effect. We are now quite familiar with homeschooling and home office, but also this has a media effect on both sides. And what we are doing today, online classes at the university, is also somehow ambiguous. It's wonderful today. I couldn't have come to Indonesia for 1 day, but it's a difficult thing. If we have only online classes in our regular university system, then the students really prefer to be in classroom and talk to their professor personally. I come to my last slide and some concluding remarks. My friends, also to open the discussion, the corona pandemic is indeed the biggest challenge of the world economy in history. The effects on trade and supply chains are enormous. But countries show, and this is something we have to say as optimists, show resilience and strength in international corporations. Last week, we had the G7 summit in Germany, and also Indonesia was there on the G7 summit. I was very happy to see them. And the international cooperation seems to work. We have an instrument that vaccination is and will remain the key to full recovery. And therefore, my last point is I'm sure that we will find a way to survive this crisis. Thanks for your attention. Thank you for giving me 2 extra minutes, and excuse that I lost my voice a little bit, but I hope it's coming back when I drink something. Danke, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Wentzel. It was very, very good presentation. And well, it's so inspiring in terms of getting to know more about the sport economics as well. Yeah, we haven't seen that probably that much in Indonesia, but now we see that in a bigger picture, as you presented before. And it was also very interesting that you show us about the big impact of COVID-19 on the European economy. I think that's very interesting and also shocking as well, because looking at the magnitude of the impact itself on the economy. Okay, I will invite the participants and or the students here to ask questions, or to say some comments probably. Yeah, go on, Jovan and Almara.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Professor Wentzel. If I may, I want to ask a question. So previously, it is explained that coronavirus have a direct cost, and one of those direct costs is the reduce of the tax revenue. For example, like that. Since tax revenue is decreasing, which is caused by a chain reaction for many of the macroeconomic indicator, doing fiscal policy to combat the recession is very difficult. That is why many countries start to use monetary policy in conjunction with fiscal policy to help the recession. So my question is that in Germany, does the Germany use some kind of monetary policy that specifically unconventional policies, just like quantitative easing that are being done like in the US or in the UK, for example, like that? And my last question is that in the previous slide, the European Union issued bond and credit to combat many of the problem in the European Union. I don't really understand the system in the European Union. Does European Union has a central bank? I know that it states in the country of the European Union have each of their own central bank. So what I ask the second question is that when the European Union as a whole issued a bond or credit, is it the same as the normal OMO, which is a open market operation which is done in the central bank in its country? And does the European Union do a quantitative easing in as a whole? Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot for the question. Well, I could now talk 2 hours about that, because you really, Jovan, hit one of my favorite topics to discuss. And every semester, we are visiting the European Central Bank with our international students. Every semester, I take them to Frankfurt. And in the last 2 years, we did it digitally. So that means the European Central Bank policy is one of the key points in my teaching and my Ph.D. in monetary economics. So I'm always interested in that kind of policy. To your first question, Jovan, the European Union has 27 member states, and 19 of these member states have joined one single currency, the euro. So that means the euro is indeed a historical experiment that has never been seen like this before on the planet. We had cases of currency unions, but not that 19 countries, and including big countries like France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and so on have joined the same currency. That means, of course, the European Central Bank has to play its role. And you said, Jovan, fiscal policy and monetary policy. These are two players on the same side that have to work together in order to overcome the pandemic. I mentioned very shortly in one bullet point of my slides, so-called PEP. PEP, abbreviation standing for Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programs. So this is a program where the central bank is buying a lot of assets to bring liquidity to the market to support the economy in the recovery. To your second question. Yes, indeed, we still have the Deutsche Bundesbank in Germany. We still have the Banque de France in France. But the monetary policy is made in the European Central Bank. And it's a classical case of supranationalities. And that means only the European Central Bank is responsible for monetary policy. And the role of the national central banks is just to bring this into the whole system, to distribute this to the national systems. This is necessary, Jovan, because, for example, in Ireland, we have a capital market-based financial system. And in Europe, we have a bank-based financial system, France, Germany, Netherlands. That means a monetary impulse from the central bank has to be transformed into an impulse that works for every system. And therefore, we have only one monetary policy. There's no German monetary policy anymore. It's gone all to the central bank. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I saw Almara also raised her hand. You want to ask question as well?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity and also the amazing presentation, Professor Wentzel. So my question is that you say that in the future, EU will receive independent financial resources, and one of them coming from the carbon tax starting from 2023, if I'm not mistaken. However, though, I find that this tax will surely increase the production cost, and not all businesses are sufficient enough to pay for the tax because those businesses might not have the alternative to switch into a better equipment. So not mentioning that the current priority for those businesses is to recover from the declines due to the pandemic. So my question is, since I know the importance of carbon tax towards the climate condition and the government income, how do you think is the most efficient way to implement the carbon tax that does not burden the business and avoid the risks of crimes? Thank you so much.
Amara, I love your question. I really appreciate that for two different reasons. First is it could not be more up to date. And you know that Indonesia was invited to come to the G7 summit in Germany last week. And so they talked a lot about CO2 emissions during the G7 summit. So that you could not be more up to date with the topic. And a few weeks ago, I gave a speech at an organization in Germany from close to the Green Party that is interested in environmental things. Bund für Umwelt und Naturschutz, so the Association for Environmental Protection. And we all agree that we should have a CO2 tax. Technically, by the way, as an economist, it's a PIGU tax from the classical PIGU instrument. But of course, we don't know how high it should be. Because then what you said will happen, we will increase the production costs for all things. That's a point. And we have another European problem, because in the common market of Europe, there are not distortions allowed. But right now, the CO2 tax that Sweden is launching for Swedish company is much, much higher than the CO2 tax that is proposed in Latvia. That means there will be a huge difference between the country, and this is an obstacle to competition and fairness. So that means we have to find a way to bring the CO2 tax to a point that it is more or less leveled out in all European countries. That is a very critical point. Now, a side remark to all of us. I admit, I confess, I love to travel and I love to fly. And so I know I spend a lot of CO2 with my travels. Well, if we all agree that CO2 is one of the biggest threats to the world and to the world climate, then we have to put a price on it. But the price can only have an effect and guidance and incentive if the price is high. So maybe in Europe, we have to say goodbye to these cheap flights of the open sky thing. Cheap flights, 35 euros in Germany. You can fly from Germany to Ireland, from Germany to Morocco for 35 bucks. I think this will not be possible with the CO2 tax anymore. I agree, Omara, to what you have said. We need a CO2 tax, but we have to find an intelligent way to reduce CO2 emissions and not to kill our economy at the same time, because we have the financial crisis, we have now the Ukrainian crisis, we have now the Corona crisis. So it's a multi-purpose crisis, and a high increase of taxes might further reduce economic activity. Does this answer your question, Omar?
Perfect, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please, for those of you who are interested as well in sport economy, I think that's fascinating to discuss. Anyone who is a fan of football?
Yeah, maybe I can do something to stimulate the discussion on this point, Luluk.
Oh, yeah, there was a question.
Oh, yeah.
Professor Wentzel, yeah. Pramantio.
Okay, so thank you for the chance to ask question. So yeah, how do the digital business taxation work, and why would you tax business digitally? Because I think it doesn't cause any emission because you do it in the open source web. Thank you.
Bramantio, I have not 100% understood acoustically your question. Luluk, could you repeat that? Did you get the full point? It was a difficult transmission for me.
Yeah, how do you tax the digital economy? Because it's kind of open source, right? Because there might be difficulties in putting some tax on the digital platforms.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, first side remark. Also, the digital economy has a carbon footprint. This is sometimes neglected or overseen. Also, digital economy, what we are doing right now, has a carbon footprint. Of course, it's much, much lower than if I had traveled to Indonesia and have seen you in person. What we are doing here is lower than that, but also the digital economy has a carbon footprint. When it comes to the taxation of digital enterprise, it's really difficult to find a solution. For example, the company Google makes a huge, huge profit in Europe, but literally pays not a single penny in taxes. So, and if you work as a professor at a university, you pay a lot of taxes. I have my maximum tax rate as a professor in Germany is 43% income tax, only income tax. And Google pays zero tax. So we are now trying to find a way to also put a tax on digital businesses like Google. And France, they were the first to launch such a tax and propose such a tax. But I think we have to find something on a European level that digital business can be taxed. When it comes to the financial transaction, and they're also part of the digital world, things are even more difficult. You can have financial transaction 10,000 in less than 1 minute. So that means financial transactions have lost any relation to the real world, where you hand a product and give it to somebody else, and then the business is in a one-to-one relation. So the financial transaction in the digital world need to be taxed because they create value, and everything that creates value needs to be taxed. But it's so hard to really find out exactly what would be the appropriate tax rate. And this business is so volatile that if you tax financial business in Ireland, it disappears within a day and goes to the Netherlands or to another country. So that's why only a joint action, worldwide joint action on a digital tax is appropriate. The good sign is now the new US government with Joe Biden, they also agreed that there has to be a digital tax and that they will not find special exemptions for US companies, because most US companies, no matter if it's Google, if it's Alphabet, if it's Zoom or whatever, most of these US companies have a very strong market positions, and they would be affected maybe the first if such a new tax would be introduced. Bramantio, does this answer your question? Yes, thank you.
Yes. Great. Any other questions? Mahatma, go on.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I have a couple of questions, actually. So what I read from the news, just a while ago, Germany closed the Nord Stream pipelines, right, following the Ukraine and Russia crisis. I just want to ask your perspective on this, because I don't get the thinking process behind this decision in terms of bettering the financial position of the country. And then...
Mahatma, how much time do you have? 2 hours is okay for you to answer that question? Luluk has mentioned in my introduction, or his introduction about me, that I was a visiting professor at New York University, at Penn State, and also in Moscow at Lomonosov University. And I still have a lot of friends in Moscow. And so I have to admit that I always supported the idea of Nord Stream 2. And just a side remark, really a side remark, but history is important, Mahatma. During the time of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union exists, still there were gas pipelines between the Soviet Union, the communist Soviet Union, and Germany. And even the communist Soviet Union was reliable as a partner on gas. So that's why I personally, and many economists had my opinion, and also many politicians had my opinion, I thought there's nothing wrong about having a business relation between Germany and Russia. Russia is the biggest state in the world, so why shouldn't we have business with Russia? I was a professor at the Moscow University, so they are doing business. Of course, Mahatma, this has changed after the war started. We were all shocked about that, totally shocked and very surprised. I did not expect it. And I was asked, because I have this Russian background, I was asked by many people the weeks before it started, hey, Dirk, do you really think that Putin will attack the Ukraine? And I said, no, never. That was my wrong assumption, because I said, all the oil and gas, that's his business. He will not destroy his business. But obviously, right now, other political considerations are important, and that's why Nord Stream 2 is now cancelled, and Nord Stream 1 is cancelled from the very first moment, because it's going from Russia through the Ukraine to Germany. And we have now, and I gave a speech 2 weeks ago to an American group about the EU energy policy. I could just change the slides and give you that presentation too. The European Union is now trying to get away from oil and gas, from CO2 fuels, as soon as possible. And now the biggest energy transition has started in Europe that has ever started. And because we have to be independent from Russian oil and gas, hopefully by the end of the winter. Last remark to all of you guys. I love to teach economics, and I always try to keep politics completely out of my classes. We only talk about money markets, monetary policy, integration stuff, trade. But now we see that we have a threat nobody had foreseen, and that we have the first war on the European continent since 80 years. And we are all a little bit concerned and shocked about that. So, but now, to answer your question, Mahatma, in a very short and final way, Nord Stream 1 is over, Nord Stream 2 is over, and I don't see any perspective for any recovery of that business as long as the war goes on. Does this answer your question, Mahatma?
Yes, actually, thank you.
Right. Thank you. Shed?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to touch on the matter of quantitative easing and at the same time the whole Europe and Russia situation. So Europe, the ECB started quantitative easing around 2015 at a much higher rate due to the declining inflation rate, the HICP. And while it was slowly recovering and they were seeing the result they expected, but in 2020, when the COVID-19 hit, the inflation rate dropped again until in 2021 it's rising to 8% and it's increasing. So now as a response, the ECB is slowing down the quantitative easing, and also obviously the US and although countries around the world, they are responding to the threat of high inflation rate. But now the problem is when the whole world is trying to respond to it, and the ECB is also slowing down QE. What would be the implication for the whole Eurozone for the next 5 years? Because obviously they had a prolonged issue of low inflation. Now, as a direct effect of ECB slowdown, paired with the spillover from the US slowdown, would it go to a much worse situation than before?
That's a wonderful question, and I may answer it with a personal memory about that, okay? Because a few years ago I was invited to Wuhan University, which became famous for a different point, and I had to give a speech there about trade. And there was a guy from the European Central Bank, but he got sick. So I had to replace the European Central Bank on this conference, and I talked about QE. And so I can go back to my slides from that conference. QE, or unconventional monetary policy, or MMT, modern monetary theory, and things like that, are all more or less labels for the same way of monetary policy, which provides a lot of liquidity to the market. Point. You're absolutely right, Shahid. The policy was appropriate when the financial crisis started because we saw signs of deflation. So it was exactly the point that the inflation rate was so low that it was really hitting the 0% at one point. And you know, and that's how I teach it in my class, inflation and deflation are the ugly twins. Inflation, deflation, the ugly twins. And then when the European Central Bank was successful to fight deflation with unconventional monetary theory and, to be honest, with a lot of liquidity in the market, they were successful. But now the opposite had happened, and we see now inflation rates of 7.9%. That's the rate right now for this month. And we see an unprecedented case. But when you calculate the overall inflation rate, you can go to a so-called core inflation rate. And the core inflation rate only goes to the basic businesses. And from that you can deduct, for example, energy prices. And when you put the energy prices on top of the core inflation rate, then you find out that, for example, right now, the core inflation rate is around 2.9%, and the energy prices, gas, oil, but also other energy points like the rare earths you need for the batteries, are more or less putting the 5% on the inflation rate. And also what leads to the inflation is the high demand, because all the supply chains are interrupted. My boy just ordered a new car and had to wait 1 year for a new car because of the disruption of the supply chain. So this is a so-called demand side shock of the inflation. So that's why we are now in a funny situation, Shahid. The central bank is watching an unprecedented inflation, but I'm now very simple. I apologize. You seem to be an expert on monetary policy, but actually they have no tools. There's nothing they can do about high energy prices. There's nothing what they can do about the crude oil prices going up. There's nothing what they can do about the Ukraine war and what Putin is doing now, reducing the oil and gas delivery for Europe. So this makes it very, very difficult to handle the inflation from a monetary perspective. You know, Shahid, I lost you now as the number one here, Shahid. There's a famous saying by Milton Friedman, so more or less the hero in monetary policy. He said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. he is right. But when we focus on the core economy, he is right. But now with the energy prices, just a side remark, and I may, as a professor, add a personal note to that. I pay for one filling of my car in Germany right now 150 euros for one filling of my car. So that is, we all suffer from these high prices. I'm a professor, I can still afford it and have a good life, but a lot of people are suffering from these high energy prices. So I don't see primarily Shahid as a monetary phenomenon. I see it more or less primarily as an energy price problem we have. Does this answer your question? Are you happy with that question, or do you have a different perspective, Shahid?
Yeah, totally. I totally answered understand the answer, and it explains everything. But I have a following question to that, which is that so as you said, it's mainly the energy inflation, right? But obviously the US is going very aggressive with the economic slowdown policies. So how big of a threat is it to the European Union, the spillover effect of the economic slowdown from US and compared with their slowdown of QE?
Well, the slowdown of QE in the United States is more or less, we call it tapering, the attempt to bring an interest rate back to the economy. What we have now is something, I'm now in the field of economics and business since 30 years, and I could never have imagined that we are in a situation of a zero interest environment. If you have money, too much money in your bank account in Germany, you have to pay an interest for that. You have to pay an interest to the bank so that you can deposit money in a bank account. And this is a very unhealthy long-term development because we need an interest rate. We learned this in Economics 101. Capital needs a lighthouse. The lighthouse is the interest rate. The interest rate in Europe is 0% now since 4 to 5 years. And in the United States, they are tapering, they're turning this around and trying to get away from QE. In Europe, it's still more difficult, my friends, because we have 19 states in the Eurozone. And for states like Italy, an interest rate increase could lead to huge financial issues.
Right. Professor Wentzel, it's already 5:53, but there is one more question. Are you okay to take one more question?
Whatever you need, Luluk.
Yeah,
it's very good questions. Whatever comes up.
It's indeed very interesting discussion. So one more question, one last question, Afif. Go on. Go on, Afif.
So, thank you for the opportunity. I would like to ask regarding the media and entertainment sector. As you mentioned before, lots of streaming services got a positive boom of users and memberships. Do you think that after the new normal is implemented or the case of the pandemic goes down, do you think that those industries will get decreasing revenues and income? And if yes, do you know how to prevent all of that? Thank you.
Very good question. We already see the value of Netflix is declining now. So the Netflix boom of the first days of the pandemic has turned around a little bit. But Afif, your question goes a little bit more deep, and therefore I really think that's a perfect last question for our summit here. Can we go back to normal? Can we go back to a pre-corona status? And my clear answer to that, to all of you guys, is no. I think the corona pandemic has changed the way we are doing business completely, and we will not go back to normal. For example, I love to teach in classroom, but during the pandemic, I offered online classrooms on and the opportunity for personal meetings online. I will definitely stay with this. And I think there will be a lot of examples that business meetings will now be online, at least to some degree. A friend of mine is a CEO of a big German automotive company, and he used to fly to Brazil for one meeting and fly back on the same day. This kind of business is disappearing. This is not coming back. We have now the opportunities to replace this with digital tools. And therefore, we have to find new ways to communicate also. When it comes to Amazon, when it comes to Netflix, when it comes to Google and other things, I don't see any end of their development coming. We are living now in a very, very digital world. And long story short, I don't think that we can go back to the pre-corona status quo. Afif, does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. I think that ends our discussion perfectly. So thank you so much once again, Professor Wentzel. I believe that you have given us a valuable insights on the topic. And unfortunately, we haven't discussed much about the sport economy. So probably one day we can invite you again to specifically talk about sport economy, because I'm really interested in that. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have much time left. So thank you so much again, Professor Wentzel, and everyone who are attending the session today. Thank you so much once again, Professor Wentzel and everyone. I hope you are all safe and healthy wherever you are, and have a good day.
Thank you so much also from my side. And Luluk, if you want to have a special presentation only on sports management, sports facilities, sports competition, I'm in.
Sure, yes, that's going to be amazing. Thank you so much.
Auf Wiedersehen. Take care.
Take care, bye.